This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
My paper is called The Luxurious Fancies of Vice, Sexual Connection and Material Pleasure in the 18th Century Erotic Imagination. In the last quarter of the 18th century, a young man who had just turned 21 wrote to a woman he had become sexually involved with, hoping to meet her again to, quote, enjoy uncontrolled delights with her. Her marriage to another complicated their available time together and made it difficult for her to escape her husband and travel to him. He remained optimistic, however, persuasively urging her to leave no scheme untried, no art unpracticed, to gain permission to visit his house, which he was busy redecorating for our especial delight in reunion. As they recalled memories of their last encounter and looked forward with anticipation to their next, they brought to mind, in fantasy and memory, the physical furnishings and architectural spaces where they conducted their affair. This paper will show the connection between luxury goods, architectural spaces, emotions, and sexuality. Particularly in regard to sexual memory, spatial settings and the material culture that they contain were not merely background, but rather an integral piece of the erotic puzzle. Manufactured goods and the material culture of love played a part in the physiological workings of the brain. These material prompts affected the encoding and retrieval of information, what we call memory. Because memory is so closely linked to emotion, the firing of axons coincide with chemical reactions generated by neurons affected by the chemistry of biological emotional response. The ability to recall information, and indeed the selection of that information for encoding, depends on the emotional state of the person at the time of the event. Recall is affected by the emotional state not only at the time of encoding, but also at the time of retrieval. Thus, memories change over a number of years and are subject to emotions before, during, and after the events that inspire them. A late 18th century case study for this process involves the secret lovers William Beckford and Louisa Pitt. In 1781, when William Beckford reached his majority, he was the richest commoner in England, with a net worth of more than £1 million in cash and extensive properties, including the impressive Fonthill estate. Louisa, the daughter of Baron Rivers, had been unhappily married to William's cousin, Peter Beckford, for 8 years before she began her affair with William. Peter Beckford was an avid hunter, more interested in foxes than his wife. His literary ambitions would be realized in Thoughts on Hunting in a series of familiar letters to a friend, while William's imagination would run to racier topics, eventually producing one of the first Gothic novels, Gothic, about a licentious Arabian caliph and his harem. Although Beckford is more famous for his homosexuality, especially his participation in the public scandal of the Powderham Affair, he also had relationships with women. Louisa became his confidant and eventually his lover. Both during their affair, which lasted over a 3-year period, and later when they recalled memories of it, William and Louisa focused on and emphasized the erotic and exotic luxury objects in the background of their trysts. Even in highly emotional letters to one another, these luxury goods and the architectural spaces are referenced alongside deeply personal feelings. Not only were these objects inseparable from their lived experience and subsequent memories, they were part of a greater economy of sexual expression and refinement that began to be developed and negotiated over the course of the long 18th century. From the 16th century, Orientalism and luxury were understood to be closely linked to sin and sexuality as they arose from the barbarous East, a place of heathenism, harems, and sensory indulgence. Orientalism could also suggest subversive sexuality and sexual variety, either from a libertine who seduced women, or a homosexual or bisexual who indulged in unregulated sexuality. Conversely, luxury goods were also associated with the wooing of mistresses and wives, who could be won over sexually from exchange of costly objects. Though the material culture of love included legitimate and honored material objects such as wedding rings, an exchange of gifts often preceded illegitimate sex as well. Samuel Pepys treated his mistress to a lobster. William Beckford treated Louisa to a fantasy-made reel. In this way, material luxury goods stood variously as a synecdoche for licentious sex, a contract negotiating future sex, and a payment for sexual services rendered. When William Beckford decided to seduce and marry Louisa, he relied on more than just flattering words and promises of love. Beckford called on the persuasive powers of his pocketbook to provide material surroundings of impressive splendor and substance, designed to overwhelm the senses and convince the most reticent to surrender to his passion. In a series of exchanged letters, Beckford and Louisa referenced the material goods of luxury that became entangled in their sexual acts, in their identities, and in their memories and thoughts. For example, looking forward to future sexual exploits, Beckford built anticipation through promises of material splendor. In his letter to Louisa on November 19, 1781, Beckford mentioned the material preparations for their future sexual bliss and assured her that his decorator was utilizing every creative impulse in his, quote, fevered imagination to create a fairy world of their favorite apartments, the site of their adulterous sex. Let me seize the planetary hour, my beloved Louisa. Let us enjoy uncontrolled delights. Let me convince you to leave no scheme untried, no art unpracticed, for gaining permission for coming to Fonthill, where every preparation is going for wants that are much admired and admiring. Louderberg, for he dotes upon us both, in all the wildness of his fevered imagination, can suggest or contrive to give our favorite apartments the strangeness and novelty of a fairy world. This very morning he sets forth with his attendant genie, and sworn by one of his principal imps, in less than 3 weeks from time present, a something that eye has not yet seen, nor heart of man conceived, shall be created for our especial delight and reunion. This was not merely an affair conducted in architectural spaces of grandeur then. These rooms, rather, were specifically a sexual haven, planned, purchased, and executed, according to William's own pen, for our especial delight and reunion. The material objects of the rooms, silk hangings and luxury accoutrements, provided a visual and haptic overload even in the absence of sexual activity. Similarly, as he prepared to host a Christmas party that would end in scandal, William Beckford was able to make his fantasies a reality through the meticulous acquisition and arrangement of material goods, imbuing these purchased objects with an erotic frisson that became all the more intense when these objects and spaces became witnesses to sexual relationships and possibly orgies, and when they subsequently inspired sexual thoughts in the form of memories or fantasies. These objects and architectural spaces performed emotional work, functioning as aide-memoirs in social situations, and also as physical prompts to biological response in the brain. The setting William Beckford created for his notorious Christmas dinner was his first social expression of unbridled fantasy. Surrounded by the furnishings found in Oriental harems, Beckford cemented his association with the loose morals of the East by conducting a simultaneous affair with a married woman who happened to be his cousin's wife, as well as a boy, all while ensconced in an architectural setting that reinforced his ties to homosexuality, illicit sexual practices, sin, and luxury. And this is Fonthill from an engraving in 1823. If the nation as a whole were becoming more accustomed to a superfluity of items in their houses, on their persons, and at their tables, Beckford was a pioneering force of change by taking these items to the next level as props in his sexual fantasies made real. William Beckford's Christmas party, held over 3 days at his estate, was a, quote, voluptuous festival, intended to impress his guests and transport their senses to the highest realms of refinement. As he wrote later in a letter dated from 1844, quote, throughout the arched halls and vast apartments we ranged in prevailed a soft and temperate radiance. The solid Egyptian hall looked as if hewn out of a living rock. The line of apartments and apparently endless passages extending from it on either side were all vaulted. An interminable staircase, which when you looked down it appeared as the well in the pyramid, and when you looked up was lost in vapor, led to suites of stately apartments gleaming with marble pavements, as polished as glass, and gaudy ceilings painted by Casali with all the profligacy of pencil. Through all these suites, through all these galleries did we roam and wander, too often hand in hand, strains of music swelling forth at intervals, innocent, affecting sounds that stole into the heart with a bewitching languor and melted the most beloved susceptible of my fair companions to tears. Delightful indeed were these romantic wanderings, delightful the straying about this little interior world of exclusive happiness, surrounded by lovely beings. The slightest approach to saneness was here untolerated. Monotony of every kind was banished. Even the uniform splendor of the gilded roofs was partially obscured by the vapor of wood aloes ascending in wreaths from cassolets placed low on the silken carpets and porcelain salvers of richest Japan. The delirium of delight into which our young and fervid bosoms were cast by such a combination of seductive influences may be conceived but too easily. It was, in short, the realization of romance in its most extravagant intensity. Reflecting back on that day 63 years later, Beckford echoed the emotions he had experienced so many decades ago in youth, confirming the power of remembered pleasure to affect his current mood. Though at 84 he was, quote, chilled by age, still more by the coarse, unpoetic tenor of the present disenchanting period, I still feel warmed and irradiated by the recollections of that strange necromantic light. Beckford was never known to spare expense, and every detail of his voluptuous festival was intended to seduce. The orientalist setting created with silken carpets, a table gleaming with silver, and porcelain salvers of richest Japan was further enhanced with an abundance of drapery, and, quote, so that every sense might in turn receive its blandishments, tables covered with delicious viands and fragrant flowers glided forth by aid of mechanisms at stated intervals from richly draped and amply curtained recesses. Fonthill architecture easily lends itself to orientalizing, as it already contained exotic architectural spaces such as the Egyptian room and the Turkish room. An eerie glow was achieved by Philip de Lutherberg, a set designer who had become a specialist in lighting techniques. One of the unique characteristics of the light at the Fonthill party was the complete absence of natural light for 3 days. Quote, the party was kept private, the doors were locked, and the windows shuttered. By using the material culture of luxury to construct the furnishings, Beckford was simultaneously crafting an architecture of emotion. Benno Gamrel's claim that, quote, distinctive emotional practices prevail in distinctive spatial settings is particularly important in the case of William Beckford's notorious party. The sexualized environment and relaxed social mores were possible only through the symbolically charged and socially established cues of Eastern luxury goods. The drapery, uniformly gilded roofs obscured by wood of aloes, porcelain salvers of finest Japan, and other Oriental luxury items indicated a more permissive and private atmosphere for the guests, even as they echoed the fashions of an Oriental harem. Just as luxury objects could enhance and inspire feelings of contentment, inferior goods could inspire despair. Exactly 1 year after that voluptuous festival at Fonthill, Louisa found herself in very different circumstances. With poor health forcing her to journey abroad with only the company of her despised husband, she was depressed. When expressing to William her regret at, quote, being banished 10,000 miles from the lovely spot you inhabit, she merges material culture with sexuality to highlight her misery. Quote, the moments I regret most bitterly are those when we enter your silken apartments to enjoy our happiness. Whereas the Fonthill fete had catered to every sense and raised it to an Elysian refinement, her room at Grignol's was a dystopian nightmare, quote, hung with dark tapestries and illuminated not with the celestial light a la Lutherberg, but lit with a single taper. As her medial temporal lobe retrieved images of past luxury and indulgence with William, her emotions overwhelmed her, and she used the description of her comparatively impoverished rooms to reflect and underscore the feelings of her impoverished soul. If the Christmas at Fonthill had been the, quote, realization of romance in its most extravagant intensity, the Christmas that followed was, for Louisa, the epitome of isolation and dearth. As she recalled the luxurious fancies of vice they had enjoyed the year previous, Louisa encouraged William to do the same. Recollect this day last year and think of how I must suffer when I compare it to this. The Christmas Day of 1782 not only lacked the innovative fantasy-scape created by Beckford, but also the bare decencies of privileged existence. To add insult to injury, the single bed, upon which I must rest my weary limbs, was dirty. Denied the reality of her sexual memories, Louisa would not even benefit from sleep in this pathetic substitute for her erotic dreams. Memory is largely concerned with emotions and images. Both emotions and images are enhanced through specific spatial settings. Therefore, the links between sexual activity, memory, and material culture, including architectural spaces, should be examined not only through the lens of art historical analysis, but also through current understandings and insights that 21st century medicine and science provide. New advances in the field of neuroscience have enabled doctors and researchers to pinpoint brain activity and explain the physiological underpinnings of emotion and memory. Episodic memory is encoded simultaneously by several different areas of the brain and is concerned with the sights, smells, tastes, and sensations that compose an individual memory. New research suggests the most potent memories of all are autobiographical memories, defined as memory for the events of one's life. Autobiographical memories constitute a major crossroads in human cognition where considerations relating to the self-emotion, goals, and personal meanings all intersect. Critical lifetime events are amongst the most emotional moments of a person's life, leading to highly emotionally encoded memories. Memory and fantasy are closely linked. The reliance of the brain on visual stimulation and the formulation of individual pictures, landscapes, and dreamscapes results in private, personalized imagery that cannot ever be exactly reproduced. We can know of elements or discrete parts of a memory another describes, but even in the time between hearing and processing the words we hear, which is in a nanosecond, the image is tailored to our own paradigm and processed with past imagery and other physiological functions that cannot be replicated in an objective way. From generic words to highly specific phrases, the mental images that resonate in each listener's mind are specific, unique, and influenced by a host of external information and biological processes that are deeply entrenched with issues of personal identity and emotion. Just as one cannot embed a universal image in the minds of individuals, neither can other sensorial perceptions or visual imagery be separated out from the memory itself. Certainly a person can choose to concentrate more on one aspect than another, but the impulses to the brain connected with thought, emotion, and mental imagery are more holistic than discrete. Louise's recollection of silken apartments is a synecdoche of shared sexual experience with Beckford, but her reaction to silk hangings, as opposed to the wooden marquetry on a tabletop or a mullioned window, are unique to her emotional attachment and mental impressions and are thus highly individual. In the moment of experience, these sensations and emotions were vivid enough. But when recalling the events as a memory after time had passed, Louisa was even more emotional, recording her heightened feelings of love and despair with added bitterness because what delighted her was out of reach. Environmental reinstatement effects trigger automatic and uncontrolled memory recall. Long-term reinstatement effects occur when a person returns after many years to a building or location where they had become emotionally invested. These floods of memories, overwhelmingly episodic and autobiographical, remain out of the control of the individual. The site of the walls, architectural details, and feelings associated with that location, as validated by the limbic system so long ago, send the medial temporal lobe into overdrive, retrieving encoded information that may not have been accessed for years. In this way, the material objects of emotion serve as tangible prompts for the brain, giving rise to the deep emotions associated with the past location and the memories that live there. Mood-congruent and mood-dependent memory are also state-dependent, but instead of relying on external sensory input, these depend on the emotional state of the individual recalling the event. Mood-congruent or dependent memory also influences the feelings we associate with memories brought back. Thus, a depressing memory recalled in a depressing mood becomes compounded, whereas a joyful memory recalled at a time of joy appears even better. This is Louise Beckford. You can go see it in Leeds, and this is the hall. The luxury goods and architectural spaces that bore witness to the sexual affair of William and Louisa Beckford were not afterwards separable from their memories of the events themselves. The material objects of silken hangings, porcelain salvers, and silken carpets were not generic and could not be substituted for other objects without altering the fundamental experience of the event at the time and its subsequent recall afterward. The process of encoding a memory and its later retrieval relies upon emotional and visual prompts to access the stored information. Without several pieces of original data, the process cannot occur. Thus, the very memories that result from the neurological activity of both William and Louisa in the days, months, and years after their affair relied on the visual and haptic particulars of highly specific props and visual imagery that was present at the moment of their high emotional reactions. Objects in the settings they inhabit are not limited to affecting us only at the social level, where behavior is informed by the presence or absence of certain things, but also at the biological and neurological level, as they help the brain to encode relevant data for future recall. High emotional states cause adrenaline to rush through the body, stopping cellular growth and bodily maintenance activity for as long as the adrenaline lasts. Though useful in a fight or flight situation, new studies show that prolonged emotional upheaval ultimately causes physical harm to the body. Distress raises cortisol levels, spikes adrenaline, and stops growth. The memory of stressors, then, might have served our antecedents by preserving in their autobiographical record the information associated with such trauma and turmoil. This record ultimately ensures that our most life-changing moments remain with us, even into old age, preserving the precious data gained at the expense of our highest emotional states. Perhaps as important as the warnings about trauma, the feelings of euphoria and joy connected with high emotional states of love and acceptance are also encoded in an indelible emotional record, meant to last as long as our bodies, or, in the case of William and Louisa, to outlast them.